There is a quiet moment in the life of an empath that almost no one notices. Nothing changes dramatically on the outside. The world continues exactly as it always has been. People keep talking, waiting, demanding, judging. But something profound begins to move within the soul. For a long time, the empath believed that his mission was to feel more than others, understand more than others, trying to keep the peace where there was chaos, trying to heal wounds that were never really yours. And without realizing it, he spent years living under an invisible force, the need for approval, not a superficial approval, not just praise or recognition, but something much deeper, the silent hope of finally being understood, to finally be seen, to finally feel that his way of loving the world was not a mistake. Jung said that many people spend a large part of their lives living versions of themselves that have been shaped by the gaze of others. Silent masks, invisible roles, identities built not from the soul, but of the need to belong. And for the empath, this can become an almost imperceptible weight, because the empath feels everything. He realizes what others expect, understand what others want to hear, notice when someone needs care, notice when someone needs silence, and so, little by little, it begins to adapt, not out of weakness, but out of sensitivity. The problem is that, over the years, something starts to happen. The empath spends so much time trying to be understood, who forgets something essential. He forgets to exist without permission. This is one of the most silent trials that a rare soul can go through, because there comes a point when the empath starts noticing something uncomfortable, even after trying so hard, even after understanding so much, even after helping so many people. Still, something inside him remains tired of explaining who he is, tired of proving that his intentions are true, tired of trying to fit into places that were never meant for your soul. And it is at this moment that an almost invisible change begins. It is not a moment of revolt. It is not a moment of confrontation. It is something much deeper, a kind of inner silence, a different silence, a silence where the empath begins to realize that perhaps he has lived too long trying to be accepted by people who could never really understand him. And this does not happen as a logical thought. It happens as a sensation, a strange sense of liberation mixed with loneliness. Because when the empath starts to move away from the need for approval, something inside him dies. The old version of himself dies. The version that folded to maintain harmony, the version that tried to explain his sensitivity, the version that needed to be understood to feel at peace. And in place of this old identity, something new begins to be born. Jung described this process as part of the path of individuation, a moment when the soul ceases to live through the expectations of the world, and it begins to exist from its own inner truth. But this path is not common. Most people never get here, because letting go of the need for approval means going through one of the deepest experiences of the human soul, the experience of being alone with yourself, no applause, no validation, no guarantees. To many, this seems daunting. But for the empath who walks through that door, something extraordinary begins to happen. Silence is no longer empty, and it becomes freedom. The need to be understood disappears, and in its place comes something rare, a quiet inner presence, a silent force, a feeling of finally existing without having to ask the world for permission. This is the point at which the empath begins to enter a stage that few actually reach, a stage where sensitivity ceases to be weakness, and it becomes consciousness, where isolation ceases to be pain, and it turns into a choice, where the empath stops seeking approval, and he begins for the first time to fully inhabit his own soul. Few get here, but those who arrive never go back to who they were before, because something inside them has awakened, something that the outside world can no longer control. And when that awakening happens, the whole life begins to reorganize itself around a new identity, a quieter identity, deeper but book. In the next few moments, we will go through this invisible journey of the soul together, a journey that Carl Jung believed to be one of the rarest transformations a human being can experience, the moment when the empath finally stops living to be accepted, and he begins to live to be true. The invisible weight of living seeking approval. There is a type of weight that does not appear on the body, but that accompanies the empath for most of their life. It's not a physical weight. It is not something that others can perceive from the outside. It is a silent weight, almost imperceptible, but profoundly real. This weight is born very early. The empath usually grows up noticing things that most people don't. He senses subtle changes in the environment. He perceives invisible tensions in relationships. It captures emotions that no one has expressed in words. From an early age, he learns something that few people need to learn. Learn to adjust your own presence to maintain balance around you. If someone is sad, he softens his voice. If someone is angry, he tries to bring calm. If someone is distant, he tries to offer understanding. At first, this seems like just sensitivity, but over time, something deeper begins to form. The empath begins to feel that they need to maintain the emotional balance of the world around them. And without realizing it, he begins to carry a responsibility that was never really his. The responsibility to be accepted. I don't accept it superficially, but I deeply accept it. Accepted as someone worth keeping around. This search for approval is rarely conscious. The empath doesn't wake up thinking they need validation from others. It's not something he plans. It is something that happens silently within the framework of your sensitivity. Because those who feel deeply also realize when they are not understood. It notices when its intensity is seen as exaggeration. He notices when his empathy is interpreted as weakness. He notices when his way of loving seems strange to people who live in a more superficial way. And so, little by little, he begins to adapt, not to deceive the world, but to avoid rejection. He learns to diminish certain parts of himself. He learns to hide certain emotions. He learns to explain less what he feels. Carl Jung said that many people live a large part of their lives identified with what he called a persona. The persona is the mask we use to adapt to the world. It's not a lie, but it is also not the totality of who we are. For the empath, this mask can become especially heavy, because it is born from the attempt to protect your own sensitivity. He begins to show the world only what seems acceptable, that which does not cause discomfort, that which does not generate judgment. And so, slowly, a distance begins to emerge within the soul itself, a distance between who he really is and who he believes he needs to be accepted. At first, this distance seems small, almost imperceptible, but over the years, it grows. The empath continues to help people. It continues to offer understanding. He keeps trying to create harmony, but something inside him starts to tire, a tiredness that is difficult to explain. It's not just emotional fatigue. It is something deeper. It is the fatigue of living trying to fit into invisible expectations. The fatigue of explaining feelings that no one seems to understand. The fatigue of feeling that you need to justify your own nature. This is the time when many empaths begin to feel an inner restlessness, a sense that something inside them is calling for change. But they still don't know exactly what needs to change, because for a long time they believed that the problem was in themselves. They believed they were too sensitive, too deep, too intense. And so, they kept trying to adjust their own soul to fit into the world. But there comes a point when something begins to reveal itself. A silent perception. A perception that changes everything. The empath begins to realize that he may never have been made to live seeking approval, that perhaps his sensitivity was never a mistake, that maybe the real problem isn't who he is, but the constant attempt to mold himself to be accepted. This recognition does not happen all at once. It comes slowly, like a soft light within consciousness, a light that begins to illuminate a truth that has been hidden for too long. The truth that the soul was not born to live by asking permission, and when that truth begins to emerge, something inside the empath initiates a silent transformation, a transformation that few around can perceive, but that, once started, it can never be interrupted again. The silent pain that only sensitive souls can feel. There is a pain that is rarely named. She does not appear in ordinary conversations. It is not discussed out loud. And often not even the empath himself can explain exactly what he is feeling. It is a silent pain, a pain that is born when someone begins to realize that they have lived a large part of their life trying to be understood by people who have never had the ability to really see them. For many empaths, this perception comes gradually. At first, it appears as a strange sensation, a sense of disconnection. They are still surrounded by people, they still talk, they still participate in the life around them, but something inside them begins to drift away, as if a part of the soul were observing everything from an unexpected distance. Carl Jung talked about moments in life when consciousness begins to expand. Moments when the person begins to perceive invisible structures that previously went unnoticed. And for the empath, one of those moments happens when he begins to see clearly something that he previously only felt. He begins to notice patterns, notice how many relationships are based on expectation, notice how many connections depend on papers, notice how many people are not really seeking to understand each other. They are only seeking confirmation of their own narratives. This realization can be deeply lonely, because the empath begins to understand that much of his life has been spent trying to maintain harmony in environments where true understanding has never been present. He realizes how many times he has silenced his own truth to avoid conflict. How many times have you explained your feelings, hoping that finally someone would understand? How many times have you offered empathy, hoping that the same level of depth would be returned? And when he looks back, something inside him is saddened, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but for recognition. The recognition that many of the bridges he built were only crossed in one direction. This moment can be painful, because the empath doesn't just lose certain illusions about others, he also loses a part of his own identity. For a long time, he believed that his role was to be the link that held everything together, the one who understands, the one who listens, the one who feels for everyone. But when consciousness begins to expand, he notices something unexpected. He realizes that he may have lived too long trying to maintain structures that have never been balanced. This perception does not turn the empath into someone cold. It does not transform his sensitivity into indifference, but it transforms his vision. He begins to realize that empathy does not mean abandonment of oneself. You begin to realize that understanding does not have to mean permanent silence. He begins to realize that true love does not require the soul to diminish itself in order to be accepted. This inner awakening marks the beginning of a profound change, because from that moment on, the empath begins to feel something new, a mixture of sadness and liberation. Sadness for realizing how much effort he made to maintain bonds that were never completely reciprocal, and liberation by realizing that your soul was never really wrong, that his sensitivity was never a defect, that its depth has never been an issue. This understanding does not happen dramatically. It arrives as a different silence within the heart, a more lucid silence, more aware, more true. And within this silence, an inevitable question is born. A question that marks the beginning of a transformation that few empaths really go through. A question that changes everything. What if I stop seeking approval, and if I just exist? What am I really like? For many, this question seems simple, but for an empath, it represents one of the most profound changes the soul can experience, because answering this question means starting to abandon an identity that has been built over a lifetime. An identity based on adaptation, in constant understanding, in a permanent attempt to maintain harmony. But when that identity begins to dissolve, something new begins to emerge on the horizon of consciousness. Something quieter, stronger, more true. The beginning of a stage that most empaths never reach. The moment the empath begins to realize that he never belonged to the outside world. There comes a time in the life of an empath when something inside them becomes impossible to ignore. For a long time, he believed that the feeling of displacement was just a phase, something that would be solved when I finally found the right place, the right people, the right environment. But the more time passes, the more he realizes that the sensation doesn't go away. It transforms, it matures, it becomes a kind of silent understanding. The empath begins to realize that his way of existing in the world has always been different. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just different. While many people are always looking for belonging through groups, ideas, or social roles, the empath begins to feel that something inside him cannot completely attach itself to these structures. He observes the conversations, observes the dynamics, observes the invisible expectations that keep many relationships functioning, and you begin to realize that a large part of these structures depend on something that your soul can no longer sustain: the constant need for external validation. For many, the approval of others works as a kind of emotional compass. It defines whether they are on the right track. It defines whether your choices make sense, defines whether your identity is acceptable. But for the empath who begins to awaken internally, this compass begins to lose strength. Not because he became indifferent, but because something deeper began to emerge within him. An internal sense of truth. Carl Jung spoke about the process of individuation as the moment when the human being begins to move away from collective expectations and begins to listen to a deeper orientation within his own psyche. This process is rarely comfortable, because it requires one to go through something that the modern world avoids at all costs: conscious loneliness. The empath begins to realize that many of the structures that once gave a sense of belonging now seem superficial. Conversations that once seemed important now feel empty. Social dynamics that once seemed natural now seem artificial. Not because the empath has become arrogant, but because his consciousness began to change position. He begins to realize that he has lived much of his life trying to find a place where his sensitivity is understood. A place where your way of feeling didn't need to be explained. A place where its depth was received without strangeness. But over time, something becomes clear. Such a place rarely exists in the outside world. And when that realization finally sets in, something unexpected happens. The empath stops looking, not by giving up, but for recognition. He realizes that he was perhaps never meant to find belonging in external structures. Maybe your journey has always been different, a journey inside, a journey where the soul learns to exist without depending on collective approval. This moment marks a profound change, because when the empath realizes that he doesn't completely belong in the outside world, he stops trying to shape his identity to fit in. And when this happens, an old need begins to lose strength, the need to be accepted. This abandonment does not happen in a dramatic way. It happens silently, as if a part of the soul finally lets go of something it has been holding on to for too long. And when that happens, the empath starts to try something new, a strange freedom. A freedom that comes with silence. A silence where there is no longer the urgency to explain who he is. This silence may seem like loneliness to those who observe from the outside, but for those who are going through this moment, it begins to become peace. And it is exactly at this point in the journey that the empath begins to approach a territory that few actually reach, a territory where identity is no longer built to please the world, and it begins to be born from the soul itself. When something inside the empath finally says, enough. There is an instant in the empath's inner journey that is not marked by words. It is not a moment of rational decision. It's not an internal conversation where he simply chooses to change. It is something deeper, something that happens almost like a sigh from one's own soul. After years of trying to understand everyone around, after years of offering empathy, care and presence, after years of trying to maintain balance in relationships that were often unbalanced, something inside him finally gets tired. It is not a physical fatigue, it's existential fatigue. A tiredness that is born when the soul realizes that it is living in constant adaptation. The empath realizes that he has spent much of his life adjusting his energy so as not to bother, adjusting your words so as not to provoke conflict, adjusting your presence so it doesn't feel too intense. And for a long time, this felt natural. It felt like part of who he was. But when consciousness begins to mature, something changes. He begins to realize the invisible cost of this constant adaptation, a cost that has quietly accumulated over the years, a cost that appeared in the form of emotional exhaustion, in the form of a sense of displacement, in the form of a lingering question within the heart. Who would I be if I wasn't always trying to be accepted? This question marks the beginning of an inner rupture. Carl Jung described something similar when he spoke about confronting one's own shadow. The shadow does not only represent negative aspects of the personality, it also holds parts of the soul that have been repressed to maintain social acceptance. In the case of the empath, the shadow often holds something powerful. The truth does not express, the intensity not lived, authenticity that has been softened to avoid rejection. When the empath begins to get in touch with these forgotten parts of themselves, something unexpected happens. He begins to feel an inner strength that he did not know before. It is not an aggressive force. It is not a force for confrontation. It is a force of presence, a sense that its existence no longer needs to be justified. It is at this moment that something inside him finally says a silent word. Enough. Enough of trying to explain your sensitivity. No more asking permission to exist. No more molding your identity to fit expectations that were never made for your soul. This enough is not directed at anyone in particular. It is not a gesture of revolt against the world. It is a gesture of reconnection with oneself. The empath begins to realize that he can continue to be sensitive without continuing to abandon himself. You can continue to understand others. Without ceasing to understand himself, you can continue to offer empathy without losing your own inner integrity. This change marks the beginning of a symbolic death, the death of the identity that depended on the approval of others to feel safe. And like all symbolic death, it makes room for something new to be born. At first, this new identity is still silent. It is still forming. He is still discovering his own way of existing. But something has already changed forever. The need for approval began to disappear. And when this happens, the empath begins to walk towards a stage that is rarely reached. A stage where sensitivity is no longer adaptation, and it turns into inner sovereignty. a stage where the equalizer no longer needs to prove who he is, because your very presence already carries the truth of your soul. The death of the old identity that needed to be accepted. When the empath finally crosses that quiet spot where something inside him says enough, a deep process begins to take place within the soul. It is not a change that happens overnight. It is not a transformation that the world immediately notices. In fact, to those who observe from the outside, almost nothing looks different. The empath continues to live his life. Keep talking to people. He continues walking through the same places. But inside him, something essential began to dissolve. For a long time, his identity was linked to the way he was perceived by others, not consciously, but in an emotional way. He felt peace when he was understood. I felt safe when I was accepted. He felt value when his presence was recognized. This structure is common in human experience, but for the empath, it usually becomes even deeper, because his sensitivity makes him constantly notice the emotional reactions around him. He notices when someone walks away, notice when someone closes down. He notices when someone does not understand what he feels. And so, for years, he tries to adjust his own expression to maintain connection. But when the process of inner awakening begins, this structure begins to weaken. The empath begins to notice something that was previously hidden. He realizes that the identity he built throughout his life was partially based on adaptation, superficial non-adaptation, but emotional adaptation, a constant attempt to be someone the world could understand more easily. When this perception becomes clear, something inevitable happens. The old identity begins to die. This death is not violent. It's not dramatic. It is a silent dissolution. Old parts of the personality begin to lose meaning. Behaviors that once seemed natural now seem strange. Explanations that once seemed necessary now seem tiresome. The empath begins to realize that he has spent a lot of time trying to be understood, when perhaps the real journey was never this. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation requires a person to abandon many of the images he has created about himself. These images function as protective structures, but they can also become invisible prisons. When the empath begins to abandon the identity that needed to be constantly accepted, he goes through a delicate moment, a moment of emptiness. Because when one identity dies, another has not yet been fully born. This interval can be silent. It may seem lonely. It can bring the feeling of being between two worlds, the ancient world, where approval was important, and a new inner territory, where something different begins to emerge. During this time, the empath learns something profound. He learns that his sensitivity no longer needs to serve as a bridge to please the world. It can simply exist. No explanation, without justification, effortlessly to be understood. This learning does not happen in words. It happens in silence. The empath begins to feel that he no longer needs to bend over emotionally to maintain relationships, not because he stopped loving, but because he finally began to love his own essence. This is the true death of the old identity, the death of the version of himself that needed to be accepted to feel safe. When this symbolic death happens, something new begins to prepare to be born, something that does not depend on approval, something that doesn't need to prove value, something that simply exists with tranquility. And when this birth begins to form within the soul, the empath begins to approach an extremely rare stage, a stage where sensitivity is no longer vulnerability, and it becomes consciousness. The birth of an inner presence that no longer needs validation. After the old identity begins to fade, something very different begins to emerge within the empath. At first, this change is almost imperceptible. It is not accompanied by euphoria. It is not accompanied by grandiose declarations or decisions. It appears as a presence, a quiet inner presence. The empath begins to realize that something inside him is more stable, more relaxed, more centered. For a long time, their emotional energy moved according to their environment. If someone was in pain, he felt it. If someone was in conflict, he absorbed it. If someone was distant, he tried to understand. This sensitivity continues to exist. It never disappears. But something has changed profoundly. It no longer defines its identity. The empath begins to realize that they can feel deeply without getting lost within the emotions of others. He can perceive the world around him without having to carry the weight of everything. This change creates a new form of presence, a quieter presence, firmer, more peaceful. Carl Jung described something similar when he spoke about the emergence of the self. The self represents the deepest center of the psyche, an inner place where identity ceases to depend on social masks and begins to organize itself around its own essence. When the empath begins to approach this inner center, something curious happens. The need for approval simply disappears, not because he decided to reject the world, but because he finally found something more stable within himself, a sense of value that does not depend on external recognition, a sense of truth that doesn't need to be explained, a sense of belonging that does not depend on groups or expectations. This inner presence completely changes the way the empath moves through the world. He talks less, explains less, tries to convince less, not because it has become distant, but because your energy is no longer trying to prove anything. For the first time, he feels that he can simply exist. This way of existing may seem mysterious to outsiders. Some people notice a change in the empath's energy, a different calm, a more stable depth. Other people may drift away because they no longer find the same emotional dynamics as before. But for the empath, something essential happened. He found his own inner base, a base that does not depend on anyone's approval, a basis that does not need to be constantly confirmed. This inner presence is one of the clearest signs that the empath is entering an extremely rare stage of the psychological journey. A stage where identity is no longer built from adaptation, but from authenticity. A stage where the soul begins to walk with a tranquility that does not need applause, a tranquility that is born when the person finally understands that their value has never been in the hands of the outside world. And when the equalizer gets here, something even deeper begins to happen. He discovers that true freedom is not in being accepted. True freedom lies in finally being whole. And it is exactly at this point that he approaches the stage that most empaths never reach. The rare stage in which the empath learns to exist without permission. After going through the dissolution of the old identity and feeling a more stable inner presence being born within him, the empath begins to enter a territory that few people actually reach. It's not a physical place. It is not an achievement that can be shown to the world. It is a state of the soul. A state where something essential finally reorganizes itself within consciousness. For much of his life, the empath has learned to measure his own existence through the reaction of others. If he was understood, he felt relief. If he was accepted, he felt safe. If he was recognized, he felt he was on the right track. But as the inner journey matures, that dynamic begins to fade. The empath realizes that something has changed irreversibly. He no longer silently asks the world if his presence is welcome. He no longer observes each environment, trying to figure out how he needs to adapt. He no longer feels the urgency to explain his depth to people who do not have the same sensitivity. This is the point at which the soul finally begins to rest. Carl Jung believed that the process of individuation takes the human being to an inner place where identity no longer depends on collective expectations. A place where one starts to live from something deeper than social approval. For the empath, reaching this point can take many years, because his sensitive nature has kept him for a long time connected to the emotions of the world around him. But when he finally makes it through this phase of the journey, something surprising happens. Loneliness is no longer pain, it becomes space. A space where the soul can breathe without interference, a space where the empath begins to perceive his own presence more clearly. At this stage, he no longer feels the need to convince anyone about who he is. He does not feel the need to be understood by everyone. He feels no need to prove that his sensibility has value, because something much more stable has emerged within him. A quiet confidence, a confidence that needs no words. He begins to realize that his soul never needed permission to exist. It never needed approval to feel deeply. It never needed validation to be true. For a long time, he believed that he needed to be accepted in order to live in peace. But now something different is revealed. Peace has never been out. She has always been waiting inside. This stage completely changes the way the empath moves in the world. He continues to be sensitive. He continues to perceive what many do not realize. He continues to feel the depth of life, but now their sensitivity is no longer connected to the fear of rejection. It is connected to consciousness. He feels it, but he doesn't get lost. He understands, but he does not abandon himself. He loves, but does not diminish himself. This change creates a different energy, an energy that does not try to dominate anyone, but it also no longer bends over backwards to fit into external expectations. It is a quiet presence, firm, deep. Some people may feel this change and get closer. Others may feel this same change and move away. But for the empath who has made it this far, this no longer defines his identity, because your identity is now born from a deeper place. A place where the soul finally recognizes its own truth. This is the stage where the empath learns something that transforms their entire journey. He learns that existing does not require permission. That feeling deeply requires no explanation. That living authentically does not require collective approval. And when that understanding finally settles within consciousness, something extraordinary happens. The empath stops walking around the world trying to be accepted, and he begins to walk simply by being. This is the moment when the inner journey reaches one of its rarest points, the moment when sensitivity ceases to be an attempt to connect with the world, and it becomes a natural expression of one's own soul. Few get here, but those who arrive discover something that changes everything. They discover that true freedom is not in being understood by everyone. True freedom lies in finally existing whole. No masks, no constant adaptations, no approval required. Just presence, only awareness, just truth. And when the empath reaches that stage, he does not become someone distant from the world. It becomes something much rarer. Someone who has finally found his own home within his own soul.